The Johnson family had been planning their summer vacation for months. Marcus Johnson, a tall man with graying temples and kind eyes, packed their silver SUV with careful precision. His wife Sarah adjusted the rearview mirror one last time while their two children, 15-year-old Maya and 12-year-old Derek, climbed into the back seat with their tablets and snacks. The morning sun painted the suburban Denver neighborhood in golden hues as they pulled out of their driveway. This wasn't just any vacation. It was their first real family trip in 3 years. Marcus had finally saved enough vacation days from his demanding job, and Sarah had arranged to work remotely for the week. The destination was Yellowstone National Park, a place they'd all dreamed of visiting together. Marcus drove steadily along Interstate 80, the family singing along to old songs on the radio. Sarah had created the perfect playlist, a mix of classics and current hits that somehow managed to please everyone. Derek was telling jokes from the back seat while Maya rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her smile. The car was filled with laughter and the kind of easy conversation that comes from a family genuinely enjoying each other's company. They stopped for lunch at a small diner in rural Wyoming, stretching their legs and grabbing sandwiches to go. The landscape was changing around them, becoming more rugged and beautiful with each passing mile. Mountains rose in the distance, promising adventures ahead. Sarah took photos of everything, the changing scenery, the kids making faces at each other, Marcus concentrating on the GPS directions. As afternoon wore on, they found themselves driving through increasingly remote stretches of highway. The radio stations grew fewer and weaker, eventually fading to static. Marcus switched to their prepared CD collection, and soon the car was once again filled with music and conversation. They passed small towns with populations counted in the hundreds, wide open spaces that seemed to stretch forever, and the occasional ranch with horses grazing peacefully in distant fields. The Johnson family felt carefree and optimistic. This was exactly the kind of bonding experience they'd hoped for, just the four of them. No work calls, no school stress, no daily obligations. Just the open road and each other's company. Sarah reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand as he drove, both of them smiling at the sound of their children's laughter from the back seat. But as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the highway, none of them could have predicted how dramatically their peaceful family vacation was about to change. The next small town they encountered would test everything they thought they knew about justice, prejudice, and the power of assumptions. Their perfect family trip was about to become something entirely different, a confrontation with ugly truths that would challenge them all and ultimately reveal the true character of both strangers and themselves. The miles stretched ahead innocent and inviting, while behind them, their comfortable suburban life grew smaller in the rearview mirror. The flashing red and blue lights appeared suddenly in Marcus's rearview mirror, cutting through the golden evening light like a knife. His heart rate increased slightly, but he remained calm. He'd been pulled over before for minor traffic violations and knew the routine. He checked his speedometer and frowned. He'd been driving exactly the speed limit, maybe even a little under. "Dad, why are we being pulled over?" Maya asked from the back seat, her voice carrying a note of anxiety that made both parents exchange glances. "Probably just a routine check, sweetheart," Marcus replied, though his own voice carried a tension that hadn't been there moments before. He pulled carefully onto the shoulder of the two-lane highway, making sure to signal properly and come to a complete stop in a safe location. 2 patrol cars had actually stopped them, something that immediately struck Marcus as unusual for a simple traffic stop. The first officer approached the driver's side window, while the second positioned himself near the passenger side of the vehicle. Both were white men in their 30s, wearing the uniform of the local county sheriff's department. Their expressions were stern, almost hostile, in a way that seemed disproportionate to whatever minor infraction might have occurred. Marcus rolled down his window and placed both hands clearly on the steering wheel, a practice he'd learned years ago for his own safety. "Good evening, officer. How can I help you?" The first officer, whose name tag read Patterson, looked into the car with undisguised suspicion. His eyes swept over the family, lingering on their faces and taking in details of their appearance and clothing. "License and registration," he demanded curtly, without offering any explanation for the stop. Sarah reached carefully into the glove compartment to retrieve the registration, while Marcus slowly reached for his wallet. Every movement was deliberate and visible, They both understood the importance of making no sudden gestures that could be misinterpreted. "Where are you folks headed?" Officer Patterson asked as he examined Marcus's driver's license with intense scrutiny, as if expecting to find something wrong with it. "Yellowstone National Park," Marcus replied politely. "We're on a family vacation." The second officer, whose badge read Coleman, had been walking slowly around their vehicle, peering through the windows and examining the license plate. "This is a pretty expensive car for a family vacation," he commented loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Mind telling me what you do for work?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly, but he kept his voice level and respectful. "I work for the federal government," he said simply. Both officers exchanged meaningful glances, and Marcus could see something shift in their demeanor. It wasn't belief or respect. It was skepticism mixed with something that looked suspiciously like contempt. Officer Patterson handed the license back through the window, but his expression had grown even more suspicious. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Patterson ordered, his hand resting casually but visibly on his service weapon. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. In the back seat, both children had gone completely silent, sensing the tension that was rapidly building around them. This was no longer a routine traffic stop. It was becoming something much more serious and potentially dangerous. Marcus stepped out of the SUV slowly and deliberately, keeping his hands visible at all times. The evening air was cooler than he'd expected, but that wasn't why he felt a chill running down his spine. Officer Patterson positioned himself directly in front of Marcus, while Officer Coleman continued his inspection of the vehicle, now paying particular attention to the back seat where Maya and Derek sat frozen with fear. "So you say you work for the federal government?" Patterson said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word of it. "That's a pretty vague answer. What exactly do you do?" "I'm a special agent," Marcus replied calmly, though every instinct was telling him this situation was escalating beyond reason. "I work in financial crimes investigation." Both officers burst into laughter, not the kind of laughter that comes from genuine amusement, but the harsh, mocking laughter of disbelief and derision. Patterson shook his head as if he'd just heard the most ridiculous lie imaginable. "A federal agent," he repeated sarcastically. "Right, and I'm the President of the United States." He turned to his partner. "Coleman, you hear this? We've got ourselves a real important federal agent here, driving through our little county with his fancy car and his made-up stories." Coleman joined in the mockery. "Must be nice making up stories like that. I bet you tell people all kinds of things about yourself." His eyes narrowed as he looked through the car windows at Sarah and the children. "Maybe we should search this vehicle, see what a federal agent carries around with him on vacation." Marcus felt his heart pounding, but he forced himself to remain outwardly calm. He'd been in dangerous situations before, real ones involving actual criminals and genuine threats. But this was different. This was his family being threatened by the very people who were supposed to protect and serve. His children were watching their father being humiliated and disbelieved for no reason other than the color of his skin and assumptions about who he could or couldn't be. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job," Marcus said carefully. "But I need to ask, what was the reason for this stop? I wasn't speeding. My vehicle registration is current and I haven't violated any traffic laws." Patterson stepped closer, invading Marcus's personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "The reason for this stop is that we received a report about a suspicious vehicle matching your description. Apparently someone saw a car just like this one casing houses in a residential neighborhood about 50 miles back." The accusation was so absurd that Marcus almost couldn't process it. They'd been on the interstate for hours, never stopping except for gas and food, never even driving through any residential neighborhoods. But he could see in the officer's eyes that facts weren't really relevant to this situation. "That's impossible," Sarah said through the open passenger window, her voice trembling with both fear and indignation. "We've been on the highway all day. We haven't been in any neighborhoods." Coleman whipped around to face her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle as well. In fact, everybody out now." Maya started to cry softly in the back seat, and Derek reached over to take his sister's hand. The sight of his children's terror cut through Marcus like a blade, filling him with a rage that he had to work desperately to control. This had gone far beyond any reasonable traffic stop. It had become harassment, profiling, and intimidation of his entire family. The Johnson family stood beside their SUV on the empty highway, the evening wind whipping around them as traffic rushed past. Other drivers slowed down to gawk at the scene, a black family surrounded by 2 patrol cars being treated like criminals for reasons none of them could understand. Sarah had her arm around Maya, who was still crying quietly, while Derek stood close to his father, trying to look brave but clearly terrified. Officer Coleman began searching through their luggage with rough, careless hands, pulling out carefully folded clothes and scattering them across the ground. Personal items that Sarah had packed with such care for their dream vacation were being treated like evidence in some imaginary crime. Sunscreen, books, the kids' favorite stuffed animals. Everything was dumped unceremoniously onto the highway shoulder. "What exactly are you looking for?" Marcus asked, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the fury burning inside him. "I've told you who I am. I can provide additional identification if needed." Patterson laughed again, that same harsh, dismissive sound. "Additional fake identification, you mean? You know what I think? I think you stole this car. I think you're running some kind of scam, pretending to be something you're not, probably targeting vacation areas where people have money." The accusation was so outrageous that Marcus felt momentarily speechless. Here he was, a man who dedicated his career to fighting financial crimes and protecting innocent people from fraud, being accused of being a criminal himself. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous and humiliating. "Daddy," Derek whispered, tugging on Marcus's shirt. "Why are they being so mean to us? What did we do wrong?" The question broke Marcus's heart. How do you explain to a 12-year-old boy that sometimes people make assumptions based on nothing more than the color of your skin? How do you tell your children that the police officers they've been taught to trust and respect can sometimes be the source of injustice rather than protection? "We didn't do anything wrong, son," Marcus said quietly, placing a protective hand on Derek's shoulder. "Sometimes adults make mistakes in judgment." Coleman overheard this exchange and spun around angrily. "Mistakes in judgment? Is that what you're calling it? I'll tell you what's a mistake. Thinking you can drive through our county with stolen property and made-up stories and we won't figure it out." Sarah had reached her breaking point. Despite her fear, despite the potential danger, she couldn't remain silent while her family was being abused. "This is harassment," she said firmly, her voice carrying more strength than she felt. "You have no probable cause to search our vehicle, no evidence of any wrongdoing, and no justification for treating us this way." Patterson turned his attention to Sarah, his expression growing even more hostile. "Lady, you're in no position to be giving us legal advice. Why don't you worry about your own problems, like being married to a con artist who's filling your kids' heads with lies about being some big, important federal agent?" The attack on her husband pushed Sarah past her fear and into pure protective fury. "My husband is exactly who he says he is," she declared, her voice rising. "He's a good man, a dedicated public servant and a loving father. And you two are making a terrible mistake that you're going to regret." Both officers exchanged another look, but this time there was something different in their expressions. It wasn't quite doubt, but perhaps the first tiny crack in their absolute certainty. Something in Sarah's voice, in her unwavering defense of her husband, suggested that maybe, just maybe, they might be wrong about the Johnson family. Marcus had stayed calm for too long. His children were crying and scared. His wife looked upset and angry. Their vacation clothes were thrown all over the dirty ground next to the highway. Cars kept driving past them and people stared at his family like they were criminals. This had to stop right now. He looked at his 2 children standing close together near the car. Maya was trying not to cry anymore, but her eyes were red and wet. Derek was holding his sister's hand and trying to be brave like his father taught him. But Marcus could see the fear in his son's young face. No child should have to go through this kind of treatment from police officers. Sarah was picking up some of their clothes from the ground. Her hands were shaking with anger. She kept looking at Marcus like she wanted him to do something to stop this madness. The officers had crossed every line of proper behavior. They were treating the Johnson family like dangerous criminals instead of innocent people on a family trip. Marcus made a decision. He had tried being polite and cooperative. He had answered all their questions honestly. He had followed every instruction they gave him. But these officers were not acting in good faith. They were not interested in the truth. They had already decided the Johnson family was guilty of something just because of how they looked. The tall man with graying hair reached slowly into his jacket pocket, He moved very carefully so the officers would not think he was reaching for a weapon. Both Patterson and Coleman watched his every move with suspicious eyes. They had their hands near their guns again, which made Marcus even more careful about his movements. "I am going to show you my work identification," he said in a clear, strong voice. "I am reaching into my inside jacket pocket to get my badge and my official papers." Officer Patterson started to say something but stopped when he heard how Marcus was talking now. The man's whole attitude had changed in just a few seconds. He was no longer speaking like someone who was trying to avoid trouble. Now he sounded like someone who was used to giving orders and having people listen to him. Marcus pulled out a black leather wallet that looked very official. He opened it up and held it out for both officers to see clearly. Inside was a shiny gold badge and an identification card with his photograph on it. The badge had the words Federal Bureau of Investigation written on it in large letters. Under his photo it said Special Agent Marcus Johnson, Financial Crimes Division. The change in both officers happened so fast it was almost funny to watch. Officer Patterson's face went from red to completely white in about 2 seconds. His mouth fell open and he stared at the badge like he could not believe what he was seeing. Officer Coleman dropped the stuffed animal he was holding and took several steps backward from the car. "This is my official FBI identification," Marcus said in a voice that now sounded completely different from before. "My badge number is 847321. You can check if this is real by calling the FBI office in Denver. You can also call the Department of Justice in Washington. You can call the Treasury Department where I used to work before my current assignment." Officer Patterson took the credential case with hands that were shaking so much he almost dropped it. He looked at every part of the identification very carefully. The official seal looked real. The security features looked real. The photograph clearly showed the same man who was standing in front of him. There was no way this could be fake. "I work for a special task force that investigates money laundering in 7 different states." Marcus continued talking in his new authoritative voice. "I have been a federal agent for 12 years. I have top secret security clearance from the United States government. My wife Sarah is a certified public accountant with her own business. My children Maya and Derek are both honor roll students at their schools. We are driving to Yellowstone National Park for a family vacation exactly like I told you when you first stopped us." Officer Coleman looked down at all the family belongings he had thrown on the ground. Suddenly, they did not look like evidence of crimes anymore. They looked like what they really were. Vacation clothes for 2 kids, family photographs, sunscreen and books and toys. The belongings of a normal American family taking a normal American vacation. Marcus looked directly at both officers with the steady gaze of a man who was used to dealing with real criminals and real emergencies. "Now I need to ask you both some very important questions," he said. "What specific traffic law did you see me break that made you pull us over? What suspicious behavior did you observe that gave you legal reason to search our vehicle? What evidence did you have that my family was involved in any criminal activity at all?" Neither Officer Patterson nor Officer Coleman could give him an answer. They stood there in the growing darkness of evening looking very small and very foolish. All around them was the proof of what they had really done. They had stopped and harassed an innocent family, based on nothing but the color of their skin and their own ugly assumptions about what black people driving nice cars must be up to. The truth was settling over all of them like a heavy blanket. These officers had just spent an hour terrorizing a federal law enforcement agent and his family. They had violated the civil rights of people who were completely innocent. They had traumatized 2 children and humiliated their parents for absolutely no legitimate reason at all. Marcus continued to stare at them, waiting for an answer that he knew would never come. Because there was no good answer. There was no legal justification. There was nothing but prejudice and poor judgment and the kind of thinking that had no place in modern American law enforcement. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Officer Patterson's face had gone from pale to red as the full implications of what they'd done began to sink in. Officer Coleman was staring at the scattered belongings on the ground, as if seeing them for the first time. Not the possessions of criminals, but the vacation clothes of 2 children and their parents. "Agent Johnson," Patterson began, his voice now uncertain and apologetic. There was a report." "What report?" Marcus interrupted, his federal training taking over completely. "I want to see the written report that justified this stop. I want to know who called it in, what they claimed to observe, and why you determined that my family matched any suspect description." Both officers exchanged desperate glances. They were beginning to realize that there had been no real report, just their own assumptions about a black family in an expensive car driving through their predominantly white county. What had seemed like reasonable suspicion an hour ago now looked like textbook racial profiling. Sarah stepped forward, her earlier fear now replaced by righteous anger. "My husband asked you a simple question when you first approached our car," she said firmly. "He wanted to know why we were being stopped. You never gave us an answer. Instead, you immediately became hostile and suspicious for no apparent reason." Maya had stopped crying and was now watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Even at 15, she was old enough to understand what was happening. Her family had been targeted not because of anything they'd done, but because of who they were. Derek moved closer to his father, and Marcus put a protective arm around his son's shoulders. "The truth is," Marcus said quietly, "you saw a black family in a nice car and assumed we must be up to something illegal. You couldn't believe that I might actually be a federal agent, despite my calm demeanor, my cooperation, and my willingness to provide identification. You chose to escalate a non-existent situation into harassment and intimidation." Coleman finally found his voice. "Agent Johnson, we were just doing our job. Sometimes we have to check things out when something seems what?" Marcus asked sharply. "When something seems what, Officer Coleman? What exactly about my family seemed suspicious to you? The fact that we were driving legally? That our car was clean and well-maintained? That we were polite and cooperative?" The officer couldn't answer because they all knew the truth. The only thing that had seemed suspicious about the Johnson family was their race combined with their apparent prosperity. In a region where most black families lived in poverty, the sight of successful black Americans on vacation had triggered assumptions and stereotypes that led to this confrontation. Patterson was now frantically trying to pick up the scattered belongings and put them back in the SUV, as if somehow reversing the search could undo the damage they'd caused. But the harm went deeper than wrinkled clothes and displaced luggage. The Johnson children had just learned a harsh lesson about how the world sometimes works, and their parents had been reminded of vulnerabilities they'd hoped their success might shield them from. "I'm going to ask you once more," Marcus said, his voice carrying the full weight of his federal authority. "Do you have any evidence of criminal activity? Any valid reason to continue detaining my family?" Both officers shook their heads silently, unable to meet his eyes. The evening air had grown cold, and other motorists continued to slow down as they passed, witnessing the aftermath of a traffic stop gone horribly wrong. Marcus closed his credential case and returned it to his jacket pocket. But he didn't move toward his car. Instead, he stood facing the two officers who had humiliated his family, considering his next words carefully. As a federal agent, he had options. He could file complaints, initiate investigations, make calls that would end careers. But as a father and husband, he had different considerations. "Officers," he said finally, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "what happened here today was wrong on multiple levels. You violated my family's civil rights, conducted an illegal search without probable cause, and subjected my children to trauma they didn't deserve. You did this based on racial profiling, pure and simple." Patterson opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished," Marcus continued. "As a federal law enforcement officer, I could make some phone calls right now that would change your lives significantly. I could have internal affairs investigators here tomorrow morning. I could ensure that this incident becomes a federal civil rights case that follows both of you for the rest of your careers." Both officers stood frozen, understanding that their futures now rested entirely in the hands of the man they'd just finished humiliating. "But," Marcus said, glancing back at his family, "I have 2 children who are scared and confused, and a wife who just wants to get to our hotel so we can try to salvage what's left of our family vacation. So instead of making those phone calls tonight, I'm going to give you both an opportunity to learn from this experience." Sarah looked at her husband with a mixture of pride and amazement. Even after everything they'd been through, he was choosing compassion over revenge, education over retribution. "I want you both to think very carefully about what happened here," Marcus said. "Think about the assumptions you made and why you made them. Think about how you would feel if your own families were treated the way you treated mine. And think about whether this is really the kind of police officers you want to be." He turned to Patterson specifically. You're the senior officer here. This happened on your watch, which makes you responsible not just for your own actions but for your partners as well. I suggest you use this as a teaching moment for both of you." Coleman stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Agent Johnson, I'm sorry. I'm really truly sorry. You're right about everything, and there's no excuse for how we treated you and your family." Patterson nodded rapidly in agreement. "Sir, I don't know what to say except that we were completely wrong. This should never have happened, and I take full responsibility." Marcus looked at both men for a long moment, seeing in their faces what might have been genuine remorse, or perhaps just fear of consequences. Either way, his message had been delivered. "Make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else," he said simply. The Johnson family climbed back into their SUV, Marcus checking that everyone was safely buckled in before starting the engine. As they pulled away from the shoulder and back onto the highway, the two patrol cars remained parked there, the officers still standing beside their vehicles as if unsure what to do next. Inside the SUV, the mood was different now. The easy laughter and casual conversation of the morning had been replaced by a more serious atmosphere. Maya and Derek had questions, lots of them, about what they'd just experienced and what it meant about the world they lived in. As they drove toward their hotel under a sky now dark with stars, Marcus and Sarah found themselves having the kind of conversation with their children that no parent wants to have but that reality sometimes demands. They talked about prejudice and assumptions, about standing up for yourself while staying safe, about the difference between the ideals of justice and the imperfect reality of human behavior. But they also talked about resilience, about not letting other people's limitations define your own possibilities, and about the importance of treating others with the dignity and respect that every person deserves, regardless of how they treat you. The vacation would continue, and in many ways it would be wonderful. But the Johnson family would never forget the evening when a routine traffic stop became a lesson in both the worst and best of human nature, and when a father's quiet strength turned a moment of powerlessness into a masterclass in dignity and grace under pressure.